The Japanese thought he was insane. His own generals called his plan suicide. But this American general saw something nobody else did, and his decision to ignore everyone would end the war in the Pacific 3 years early. The Pacific War. Japan controls thousands of islands across millions of square miles of ocean. The American strategy is to capture every single island one by one, fighting brutal battles that cost thousands of lives each time. Everyone agrees this is the only way. It'll take until 1948 to reach Japan. But then Douglas MacArthur brings in a general named Walter Kruger, hands him a map, and says figure out how to do this faster. What Kruger does next will completely change how wars are fought and save hundreds of thousands of American lives. This is that story. To understand what Walter Kruger accomplished, you need to understand just how impossible the Pacific War looked in 1943. Japan had spent decades building an empire across the Pacific. They controlled the Philippines, Indonesia, New Guinea, countless island chains, and huge portions of China and Southeast Asia. Their defensive perimeter stretched across half the Pacific Ocean. Thousands of islands, each one potentially fortified, each one potentially filled with Japanese soldiers ready to fight to the death. And that last part was the problem. Japanese soldiers didn't surrender. They'd been trained from childhood that surrender was the ultimate shame, that dying for the emperor was the highest honor. So when Americans attacked Japanese positions, the battles were nightmares. Japanese soldiers would fight until every single one was dead. They'd launch suicide charges. They'd hide in caves and tunnels and keep fighting for weeks after their position was officially captured. The casualties were horrific on both sides. At Tarawa Atoll in November 1943, it took American Marines 3 days of hell to capture a tiny island that was barely 2 miles long. Over 1,000 Americans died. Almost all 4,000 Japanese defenders died for one tiny island. And there were thousands of these islands between American forces and Japan. The American strategy at the time was called island hopping. It meant exactly what it sounds like. Attack one island, capture it, build a base, then attack the next island. Hop from island to island, gradually moving closer to Japan. It was methodical, it was logical, and it was going to take forever. Military planners estimated the war would last until at least 1948, maybe longer. Every island would cost thousands of American lives. And the closer they got to Japan, the harder the fighting would become. When they finally invaded the Japanese home islands, the casualties would be unimaginable. Some estimates said the invasion of Japan would cost over 1 million American casualties. The American public was already exhausted. Young men were dying by the thousands in both the Pacific and Europe. Families were receiving death notifications every day. The longer the war dragged on, the more deaths there would be. And in the Pacific, the progress was agonizingly slow. That's the situation when General Douglas MacArthur was put in charge of the Southwest Pacific area in 1942. MacArthur was complicated, brilliant but arrogant, strategic genius but massive ego. He'd been forced to evacuate from the Philippines when Japan invaded, and he'd made his famous promise, "I shall return." MacArthur meant it. He was determined to retake the Philippines and defeat Japan. But he looked at the island hopping strategy and saw the same problem everyone else saw. It would take too long, cost too many lives. There had to be a better way. MacArthur needed someone who could think differently. Someone who could look at the impossible logistics of the Pacific War and find solutions that nobody else saw. He needed a planner, a genius at organization and supply. Someone who understood that modern war wasn't just about brave soldiers charging at the enemy. It was about getting those soldiers to the right place at the right time with the right equipment. He chose Walter Kruger. Kruger was the opposite of MacArthur in almost every way. MacArthur loved publicity and grand gestures. Kruger avoided cameras and worked quietly. MacArthur was born into a military family and went to West Point. Kruger was born in Germany, immigrated to America as a child, and enlisted as a private. He worked his way up through the ranks over decades. No shortcuts, no family connections, just hard work and intelligence. By 1943, Kruger was commanding the 6th Army in the Pacific. But his real job was solving MacArthur's impossible problem. How do you defeat Japan without fighting for every single island? How do you move faster? How do you save American lives while still winning? Kruger looked at the maps, and he started thinking about the problem differently than everyone else. Here's what Kruger realized that changed everything. Not all islands mattered equally. The island hopping strategy assumed you had to capture every island because every island could be a threat. Japanese planes based on those islands could attack your supply lines. Japanese troops on those islands could raid your positions. So you had to clear every island to protect your advance. But Kruger looked at the actual geography and asked a different question. What if you just went around them? Think about it like this. Japan's island empire was like a chain of fortresses. The traditional strategy was to attack each fortress one by one, fighting brutal sieges at each location. But what if you just bypassed the fortresses that didn't matter? What if you identified the few islands that were actually strategically important and only attacked those? Let the rest just sit there. The Japanese garrisons on bypassed islands couldn't do anything. They couldn't leave because they didn't have ships. They couldn't threaten supply lines if those supply lines went around them. They'd just be stuck on their islands, irrelevant to the war, slowly running out of supplies. Kruger called this strategy leapfrogging. Instead of hopping from island to island, you'd leap over entire chains of islands. Jump hundreds of miles at once. Attack only the islands you actually needed. Leave the rest behind. It sounds obvious now, but in 1943, it was revolutionary. And it was risky. The risks were real. If you bypassed Japanese-held islands, those garrisons would still exist behind your front lines. If something went wrong, if they got reinforcements or supplies, they could potentially attack you from behind. You'd be operating far from your bases with enemies on multiple sides. Traditional military thinking said never leave enemy forces behind you. Always secure your rear areas. Kruger understood these risks, but he'd done the math. He'd calculated how many Japanese troops were on various islands. He'd studied Japanese supply capabilities. He'd looked at how far Japanese planes could fly from different bases. And he realized that most Japanese island garrisons were actually harmless if you went around them. They were defensive positions, set up to repel invasions of their specific islands. But they had no offensive capability beyond their immediate area. No ships to transport troops. Limited fuel for planes. They could defend their islands, but they couldn't project power beyond them. So Kruger started identifying which islands actually mattered. Which ones had harbors that could support major fleet operations? Which ones had airfields positioned to threaten key sea lanes? Which ones controlled strategic choke points? Those were the targets. Everything else could be bypassed. But identifying targets was just the first step. Kruger then had to solve an even harder problem. How do you actually attack islands that are hundreds of miles behind enemy lines? The answer was amphibious assault. Land troops from ships directly onto enemy-held beaches. The U.S. had been doing this throughout the Pacific campaign, but always on a relatively small scale and always at islands close to existing bases. Kruger wanted to do it on a massive scale and at extreme distances. This required solving logistics problems that had never been solved before. How do you transport tens of thousands of soldiers across hundreds of miles of ocean? How do you supply them once they land? How do you provide air support when they're beyond the range of your existing air bases? How do you protect the transport ships from enemy submarines and air attacks? Kruger spent months working through these problems. He coordinated with the Navy to develop new ships specifically designed for long-range amphibious operations. He worked with supply officers to create mobile supply depots that could be established quickly on captured beaches. He coordinated with the Air Force to develop techniques for long-range fighter coverage. Every detail mattered. Kruger calculated how much fuel each ship would need, how much ammunition troops would use in the first days of an assault, how many medical supplies would be required, how long it would take to unload cargo ships on different types of beaches. He built mathematical models of entire campaigns. His staff thought he was insane. They'd never seen a general spend so much time on logistics and planning. Most generals wanted to talk about tactics and strategy and bold maneuvers. Kruger wanted to talk about supply tonnages and fuel consumption rates and beach gradients. But Kruger understood something that many generals didn't. Tactics don't matter if your soldiers don't have ammunition. Strategy doesn't matter if your troops are starving. Battles are won by the army that can sustain its operations longer than the enemy can sustain theirs. One of Kruger's innovations was the development of advanced supply bases. These were forward positions established on captured territory that could support future operations. Each base had fuel dumps, ammunition stores, repair facilities, and medical stations. Kruger positioned these bases like stepping stones across the Pacific. Each one extended the range of the next operation. He also revolutionized the loading of transport ships. Traditional methods loaded cargo ships in whatever order was convenient. Kruger insisted on loading ships in reverse order of when items would be needed. The first things troops would need after landing went in last, so they'd be unloaded first. Ammunition and medical supplies at the top. Heavy equipment at the bottom. This sounds obvious now, but it wasn't standard practice at the time. Kruger made it standard. Another breakthrough was in air support. Kruger worked with the Air Force to develop the concept of mobile air bases. Engineers would land with the first wave of troops, and their job was to build a usable airstrip within 48 hours. Literally bulldozing jungle or leveling coral to create landing strips. Once the airstrip was operational, fighters could fly in, refuel, and provide air cover for the troops. This extended the range of air support by hundreds of miles. Kruger also completely changed how intelligence was gathered and used. He established special reconnaissance teams that would scout enemy positions before major operations. These teams would land secretly at night, observe Japanese defenses, and report back with detailed information. Kruger wanted to know exactly what his troops would face before they landed. How many enemy soldiers? Where the defensive positions were located. Which beaches were suitable for landing. This intelligence gathering wasn't glamorous. It was dangerous, painstaking work done by small teams who operated behind enemy lines for days or weeks. But it saved countless lives because it meant American forces weren't landing blind. Kruger knew where the threats were before his troops hit the beaches. All of this planning came together in late 1943 when Kruger launched his first major leapfrogging operation. The target was the Admiralty Islands, a strategically important group of islands about 200 miles behind Japanese lines. Every traditional military officer said it was too risky. The islands were heavily defended. The distance was too great. The logistics were impossible. Kruger ignored them. He'd done the math. He knew it would work. The invasion force consisted of about 1,000 troops in the first wave. A tiny force attacking a defended position far from support. If things went wrong, those soldiers would be wiped out. The entire operation depended on Kruger's planning being perfect. On February 29, 1944, American forces landed on Los Negros Island in the Admiralties. The Japanese were completely surprised. They'd never imagined the Americans would attack so far behind their lines. The initial landing was successful. Within 24 hours, engineers had started building an airstrip. Within 48 hours, American planes were landing and providing air support. The Japanese fought back hard. They launched counterattacks trying to drive the Americans off the island. The fighting was brutal, but American reinforcements kept arriving. Supplies kept flowing. Everything Kruger had planned for was working. Within a week, the Admiralty Islands were under American control. An entire Japanese garrison bypassed. A strategic position captured. And it had been done at a fraction of the cost of traditional island hopping. Instead of fighting for every island between the previous American position and the Admiralties, Kruger had simply jumped over all of them. The bypassed Japanese garrison sat on their islands, confused and unable to do anything about it. They'd been made irrelevant without a shot being fired at them. MacArthur was ecstatic. Kruger had proven that leapfrogging worked. Now it was time to do it on an even larger scale. The ultimate test of Kruger's planning came in 1944 with the campaign to retake the Philippines. This was MacArthur's obsession, his promise to return. But the Philippines were over 1,000 miles from the nearest American bases. The islands were heavily defended by experienced Japanese troops. And between American forces and the Philippines were dozens of Japanese-held islands. Traditional strategy said to fight your way there island by island. It would take years and cost tens of thousands of American lives. Kruger said he could do it in months. He planned the most ambitious series of leapfrogging operations in military history. The campaign would involve multiple simultaneous invasions across hundreds of miles of ocean. Hundreds of thousands of troops would be transported and supplied. It required coordination between the Army, Navy, and Air Force on a scale never attempted before. Kruger spent months planning every detail. He identified staging areas. He calculated supply requirements for every phase of the campaign. He positioned his advanced bases to support each leap forward. He established backup plans for every possible contingency. His staff worked around the clock preparing thousands of pages of operational orders. Critics said it was too complex. Too many things could go wrong. If the Japanese figured out the plan and concentrated their forces, they could destroy the invasion fleet. If supplies didn't arrive on schedule, troops would be stranded. If the Navy couldn't protect the transport ships, the whole operation would collapse. The risks were enormous. But Kruger had confidence in his planning. He'd thought through every scenario. He'd calculated the probabilities. He knew it would work if everyone executed their part of the plan. The campaign began in September 1944 with landings on Morotai, an island that would serve as a forward base for operations in the Philippines. The invasion was textbook perfect. Minimal resistance. Airbase operational within days. Exactly as Kruger had planned. Then came Leyte in the Philippines in October 1944. This was the big one. MacArthur's return. Over 200,000 American troops would land on Leyte and nearby islands. It was one of the largest amphibious operations in history. The armada of ships carrying Kruger's 6th Army arrived off Leyte on October 20, 1944. The Japanese knew the invasion was coming, but they'd been deceived about exactly where and when. Kruger's intelligence operations and deception plans had worked. The Japanese forces were not optimally positioned. The landings began at dawn. Wave after wave of landing craft hit the beaches. Kruger's loading plans meant that troops had exactly what they needed when they needed it. Ammunition was immediately available. Communication equipment worked. Medical stations were set up within hours. Engineers started building supply depots before the first day was over. MacArthur famously waited ashore that afternoon for the cameras, fulfilling his promise. But while MacArthur was giving speeches, Kruger was directing the real work, coordinating the landing of thousands of tons of supplies, positioning troops, establishing defensive perimeters, building the infrastructure that would support the campaign. The Japanese fought back with everything they had. They launched massive kamikaze attacks against the invasion fleet. They sent their navy to attack the transport ships in what became the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. They reinforced their ground troops and launched counterattacks against American positions. But Kruger's planning held up under pressure. The supply lines kept functioning despite kamikaze attacks. Reinforcements arrived on schedule. Air support operated from the newly built airstrips. Every problem that arose had been anticipated and planned for. Kruger had backup plans for his backup plans. The battle for Leyte lasted until December, but the outcome was never really in doubt after the first few days. Kruger's logistics were simply superior. His troops were well supplied and well supported. The Japanese, by contrast, couldn't get reinforcements or supplies through American naval and air superiority. They were fighting with diminishing resources while American strength grew every day. But Leyte was just the beginning. Kruger followed it with landing after landing across the Philippines. Mindoro in December. Luzon in January 1945. Each operation was a carefully planned leapfrog that bypassed Japanese strong points and struck at strategically important targets. The numbers tell the story. In the 6 months from October 1944 to March 1945, Kruger's 6th Army liberated most of the Philippines, destroyed multiple Japanese armies, and advanced the American position by over 1,000 miles. Traditional island hopping would have taken years to accomplish the same thing. American casualties were still heavy. The fighting was brutal. But compared to what those casualties would have been using traditional methods, Kruger had saved tens of thousands of American lives. Maybe hundreds of thousands when you consider how his strategy shortened the entire war. The Japanese strategy of defending every island had been made obsolete. Their garrisons on bypassed islands just sat there, unable to affect the war. Some Japanese units didn't even know the war was over until months after Japan surrendered because they'd been so completely bypassed and cut off. What Walter Kruger did in the Pacific changed warfare forever. He proved that mobility and logistics could defeat static defense. That you didn't have to fight every battle the enemy wanted you to fight. That sometimes the smartest move is to just go around the problem instead of through it. His genius was in planning. Not exciting planning about tactics and maneuvers. Boring planning about supplies and transport and logistics. The kind of planning that most people don't even think about. But that planning won campaigns and saved lives. Kruger understood that modern war was as much about organization as it was about courage. You could have the bravest soldiers in the world, but if they didn't have ammunition or food or medical supplies, they'd lose. Logistics wins wars. Planning wins wars. Details matter more than drama. Every single one of Kruger's leapfrogging operations required months of preparation. Thousands of details had to be coordinated. Supply schedules, transport arrangements, communication plans, backup contingencies. Kruger and his staff worked through all of it methodically and carefully. They left nothing to chance. And when things inevitably went wrong in combat, because things always go wrong in combat, Kruger's thorough planning meant there were solutions ready. Alternative supply routes, backup airfields, reserve units positioned to respond to emergencies. The plans were flexible enough to adapt to reality while structured enough to keep operations moving forward. Kruger's methods became the template for American military operations for decades afterward. The amphibious assaults in Korea, the helicopter mobile operations in Vietnam, the rapid deployment forces of the Gulf Wars. All of them built on principles that Kruger pioneered in the Pacific. The idea that you could use mobility and logistics to achieve strategic goals without fighting for every inch of ground. After the war, Kruger retired quietly. No grand farewell tours. No memoirs seeking credit. He just went home. That was typical Kruger. He'd never been interested in fame or glory. He was interested in solving problems and doing his job well. But military historians recognize what he accomplished. Kruger took a war that was supposed to last until 1948 and helped end it in 1945. 3 years saved. Countless lives saved. And he did it not by being more aggressive or more daring than everyone else. He did it by being smarter, by planning better, by thinking differently about the problems in front of him. The Pacific War had looked impossible in 1943, an endless series of bloody island battles stretching years into the future. Kruger saw past that. He saw that you didn't have to fight all those battles. You could go around them. You could make them irrelevant through superior planning and logistics. That's what genius looks like in real life. Not flash, not drama, just careful thought, thorough preparation, and the courage to do things differently than they've always been done. Kruger proved that a calculator and a map could be more powerful than a battleship. That the general who plans supply lines can be more important than the general who plans battles. That the boring work of logistics and organization is actually the most critical work in war. When people think about World War II generals, they usually think of Patton with his ivory-handled pistols or MacArthur with his sunglasses and corncob pipe. They don't think about Kruger hunched over supply tables and logistics charts. But Kruger won campaigns that those famous generals couldn't have won without him. The Japanese thought the Americans would have to fight for every island. They built their entire defensive strategy around that assumption. They fortified islands across the Pacific expecting years of grinding defensive battles. Kruger made all of that preparation worthless. He just went around it. That's the power of thinking differently, of questioning assumptions, of being willing to try something new even when everyone says it won't work. Kruger looked at the impossible problem of the Pacific War and found a solution that nobody else had seen. Not because he was lucky, not because he was reckless, but because he planned better than anyone else. The general with the calculator beat an empire with his planning. The man nobody had heard of ended a war that everyone thought would last for years. And he did it by paying attention to the details that nobody else wanted to think about. That's the real story of genius in war. Not always the bold charge or the dramatic last stand. Sometimes it's the guy in the back room making sure everyone has enough bullets and food. Sometimes the most important victories happen in planning sessions months before the first shot is fired. Sometimes the hero is the one nobody notices until years later when historians realize what he actually accomplished. Walter Kruger was that hero, the general who won the Pacific War with planning and logistics. The man who saved countless lives by figuring out how to fight smarter instead of harder. The genius that nobody talks about because what he did was too complex and too technical for good drama. But it worked. And that's all that mattered. Watch the next video to see another brilliant general story.